At 1 in the morning, on a deserted overpass in the pouring rain, a thin woman in a battered old sedan slammed on her brakes when she saw a black armored SUV crash into the guardrail, flip onto its side, and send smoke curling up through the downpour. Another car had just sped off into the darkness. Raylyn Hollister, 27 years old, a widow with hands worn rough from washing dishes all day and brown hair tied back in a hurry after her night shift, knew that stopping here could get her killed. She recognized that vehicle. The whole port city of Bracton recognized it. It belonged to Desmond Vale, the man whose name nobody dared say too loud. She'd pressed the gas, ready to drive away. But through the rain she heard it, a faint sound, the cry of a life slipping away, and her foot lifted off the pedal. She turned the car around. Inside, the most powerful man in the city was pinned behind the wheel, his chest soaked in blood, his black hair streaked with early gray matted down, the scar along his left jaw trembling with every broken breath. But the first thing out of his mouth wasn't a plea for himself. "Please," he whispered, those cold gray eyes holding nothing now but the fear of an ordinary man. "Save my sister first, Nora." The back seat, and in the back seat, a 16-year-old girl lay motionless, her already fragile heart going still. Without a moment's hesitation, this woman who had nothing but trembling hands and the first aid knowledge she'd learned from her late firefighter husband began pressing rhythm into that small chest, counting out loud through the rain, pulling a stranger's child back from the edge of death. She stayed. She followed them to the hospital. She sat watch over the family of the man the whole city called a monster. But when the police arrived, they didn't look at her like a savior. They looked at her like an accomplice. A poor, desperate woman standing beside a car full of cash belonging to the most notorious crime boss in the region. And then, what this poor widow did next left everyone speechless, from the hardest detective on the force to the powerful man himself. If you believe the true measure of a person is what they do when no one is watching, hit that like button, share this story with someone who needs the reminder, and subscribe so you never miss a story that touches the heart. The young girl was breathing. For the first time after a long, endless stretch of time that had seemed to have no end at all, that tiny chest rose with one faint, fragile breath, then another, and Raylyn felt as if the whole world held itself still and broke open all at once. The rain was still lashing down without mercy, its icy cold soaking through her thin shirt, but she couldn't feel anything except that delicate pulse of life beneath her hands. She bowed her head, her broken breath blending with the sound of the rain, whispering words she herself couldn't tell were prayer or gratitude. Then the siren tore through the night. Red and blue lights flashed across the bridge, slick with water, reflecting in the puddles as smeared, trembling streaks of brightness. The ambulance crawled closer, then the police cars, then a fire truck, with people in reflective gear pouring out like a rushing stream. Someone placed a hand on Ray's shoulder, and an urgent voice told her to step back. "Let us handle it." She pulled her hands away from the young girl's chest reluctantly, as if letting go would mean betraying the life she had just fought to pull back. She rose to her feet, her legs numb, staggered backward, and only then did she realize she was shaking violently, not from the cold, but from something deeper, something that had just drained itself out of her body. 2 paramedics dropped to their knees beside Nora, attaching devices Ray didn't understand, calling numbers out to each other in a language of their own. Another person bent into the overturned SUV, where Desmond Vale was still trapped behind the steering wheel, and Ray heard the sound of metal being cut, the shriek of the car door as it was forced open. She stood there in the rain, a thin figure in a soaked shirt, watching them lift the young girl onto a stretcher, watching them struggle to pull the man from the wreckage of twisted steel. She didn't belong in this scene. She knew that. She was only a woman who washed dishes on her way home, and somehow she had stepped by mistake into a story that wasn't hers. A young police officer came toward her, his flashlight shining straight into her face and making her squint. He asked whether she was all right, whether she was hurt anywhere, and Ray shook her head, though she wasn't sure that was the truth. Then the officer's eyes dropped to her hands, to the coat she was still gripping tightly, the coat she had placed under the young girl's head, now soaked with a dark color the rain itself couldn't wash away. She handed it over by reflex, and the officer took it with gloved hands, folded it carefully, slipped it into a clear plastic bag, sealed it with a label, and wrote something down. "Evidence," he said, his voice flat and without feeling. One short, cold word that turned her old coat into something belonging to another world, a world of reports, files, and suspicion. Ray watched the coat disappear into the paper bag and felt something colder than the rain slide into her heart. The ambulance doors slammed shut, carrying away the young girl, carrying away the man the whole city feared. The sirens wailed, the lights faded into the distance, leaving the bridge empty with shards of broken glass, glittering under the streetlights and the smell of gasoline still hanging in the damp air. They asked Ray for her name, where she lived, what she did for a living. She answered each question in a hoarse voice, not understanding why every answer made the police officers exchange looks she couldn't read. They told her she wasn't allowed to leave the city. They told her she would need to come down to the station to clear up a few things. They said it in the tone of people who had already decided something about her before she had even found the chance to speak. In the end, they let her drive home, and Ray climbed into her battered old sedan, both hands resting on the steering wheel without starting the engine right away. She stared into the darkness ahead through the rain-blurred windshield, and in that sudden silence, the trembling came back, stronger than before. She had done the right thing. She knew she had done the right thing. So why did her heart feel weighed down by the terrible sense that she had just crossed a threshold she could never step back from, that this rainy night wouldn't let go of her as easily as she had believed? She thought of Sammy sleeping at home, of the bills on the kitchen table, of the morning shift she didn't know whether she would still have the strength to show up for. Then she started the engine and let the car carry her through the empty streets back to her cramped apartment, without knowing that only a few hours later, a phone call would drag her back, not toward the hospital, but toward a cold room inside the police station, where people would look at her, not as someone who had just saved a life, but as someone with something to hide. The room was small and cold, with only a metal table, 2 hard chairs, and a white bulb hanging overhead, pouring down a kind of light that made every face look more exhausted than it really was. Ray had been sitting there since before dawn, her hands still marked with tiny scratches she herself had forgotten when she got them, a cup of ice-cold coffee sitting in front of her untouched. The man seated across from her was named Pryor, a detective somewhere past 40, with short-cropped salt and pepper hair and the deep-set eyes of a man who had seen too much in his life to easily believe in anything anymore. He placed a file on the table, opened it slowly, and then lifted his eyes to her with a look that wasn't exactly hostile, but held no warmth either. "You say you happened to pass that bridge at 1 o'clock in the morning," he repeated her words in a flat voice, as if the mere fact that a woman like her had been in that place at that hour was suspicious enough on its own. Ray told the story again from the beginning, told him about the night shift that had just ended, about the road she took every evening to get home, about the SUV she had seen overturned and the strange car that had roared away. Pryor didn't write much down. He only listened, cutting in now and then with a question, one designed to make her stumble, to see whether her story had any cracks in it. He asked if she knew who was inside the vehicle, and Ray shook her head, then nodded, then tried to explain the tangled truth that she had recognized the car, but hadn't known who was inside it until after she was already kneeling beside them. Pryor raised one eyebrow. "You recognized Desmond Vale's car," he said slowly, pressing weight into every word, "but you still stopped. Most people in this city, when they see that car, would hit the gas and get as far away as they could, but you turned back." Ray was silent for a moment. Then she said softly that she had meant to drive away, that she really had pressed the gas, but then she heard the young girl, and she couldn't leave when she knew there was a child dying in there. Pryor gave no reaction. He simply turned to another page in the file. He began asking about her life, and Ray understood that this was the part he truly cared about. She worked 2 jobs, didn't she, washing dishes by day and cleaning offices at night? She was a widow. Her husband had died. She had a fairly large hospital debt. Every sentence he spoke was true, but the way he threaded them together turned her life into an indictment, turned her poverty into a motive. Ray understood what he was implying, and she felt a slow anger rise inside her chest. Not the kind of anger that bursts open, but the quiet anger of a person who had become too used to being judged before being heard. "A woman in your situation," Pryor said, leaving the sentence hanging, standing beside a car filled with the money of the most powerful man in the region, at 1 o'clock in the morning, with no other witnesses. He didn't say it directly, but he didn't need to. Ray looked straight into his eyes, and for the first time through the whole interrogation, her voice no longer trembled. "I didn't know who he was when I was pressing on that young girl's chest," she said. "I didn't think about money, didn't think about who he was, didn't think about where this would drag me. I only knew there was a child who had stopped breathing under my hands, and if I had stopped for even 1 second to calculate whether this was worth it or not, she would died." The room sank into silence. Pryor looked at her for a long while, and in that moment something passed through his eyes that she couldn't read. Maybe doubt, maybe something else. Then he closed the file. They hadn't found anything on her, not a single dollar, not a single item from the vehicle, not a single trace suggesting she was anything other than exactly what she said she was. He stood up, told her she could go, but not to leave the city, and not to think this was over. Ray stepped out of that cold room when the sun was already high, the daylight so bright she had to lift a hand to shield her eyes. She didn't know that behind the door, Pryor was still standing there, watching her shadow fade away, a detective who had spent many years hunting the Valee name, and now a question had just taken shape inside his mind, a question he had no answer for, yet whether the thin woman who had just left was a link in the world he hated, or something he had gone too long without believing still existed. 2 days later, just as Ray stepped out of the grocery store, with a small bag of food bought with the last coins in her wallet, she noticed a sleek black car parked across the street, quiet and out of place in the poor neighborhood where she lived, where cars like that never appeared. An older man was leaning against the side of the car, perhaps already past 60, dressed in a carefully tailored dark suit, his silver hair combed neatly back, his posture belonging to someone long accustomed to being feared and respected. He didn't come toward her aggressively, and there was nothing in his manner that seemed threatening, but Ray still felt her heart begin to beat faster, because she knew with the warning instinct of her body that this man had come because of that rainy night. He called her by name, her full name, in a low and polite voice, and introduced himself as Wendell. He said he worked for the Vell family and that he had come only to talk, nothing more. Ray tightened her grip on the grocery bag in her hand and stood still on the sidewalk, neither stepping closer nor backing away. Wendell studied her with eyes that had looked through hundreds of people, eyes that knew how to tell a liar from a truth-teller, a greedy soul from a decent one, and what he saw in the thin woman before him unsettled him, in a way he himself couldn't explain. He said she was the one who had stopped on the bridge that night, the one who had pulled the young girl from the car and fought her breath back into her body, the one who had stayed when every ordinary rule of survival told her she should run. She had saved the man he served, and she had saved that man's younger sister. Ray only nodded faintly, not knowing how to respond to words she didn't consider praise. Wendell was silent for a moment. Then he asked her a question he had asked many people throughout his life, a question whose answer he always knew in advance, because people were all the same, and everyone wanted something. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice gentle, as if offering her something good. "Just say it. Money, a better job, payment for the trouble she had been put through. Anything within their means, and their means were broader than she could imagine." Ray looked at him, and for one moment she almost laughed at the strangeness of the question, not because it was funny, but because it came from a world so far away from her own. She didn't want anything, she said. She hadn't saved the young girl in exchange for anything. She had done it because that was what anyone should do when they saw a child dying. Wendell frowned, not out of anger, but out of confusion, a real confusion his seasoned face couldn't quite hide. He had lived his whole life in a world where everything had a price, where every favor was a debt, where no one did anything without calculating what they would get back in return. And yet here, on a cracked sidewalk in the middle of a poor neighborhood, a woman with nothing in her hands was refusing everything he offered, and somehow she was telling the truth. He knew she was telling the truth, and that very thing disturbed him. He looked at her for a long while, as if trying to solve a problem for which every formula he had ever known had become useless. Then he said, slowly, almost reluctantly, that there was another reason he had come to find her. The man he served was still in a coma, he said, and no one yet dared to be certain about his condition. But the young girl had awakened, and from the moment she woke up until now, she hadn't allowed anyone near her. Hadn't eaten, hadn't spoken to anyone. Wendell stopped, and for the first time, His voice revealed something close to tenderness, a small crack in the hard surface of a man who had spent his life working in the shadows. The young girl was only calling one name, he said, looking straight into Ray's eyes. She was calling yours. Ray didn't understand why she agreed to go with Wendell to the hospital. Perhaps because the way he said the young girl had been calling her name touched something inside her that she couldn't ignore, something stronger even than her fear of the world she was stepping into. The hospital floor was quiet, the smell of antiseptic lingering faintly in the air, and when the room door opened, Ray saw the young girl lying there, small and pale on a white bed far too large for her frail body. Nora was sitting curled up near the head of the bed, her knees drawn tightly to her chest, her wide eyes staring at the door with guarded fear, and when a nurse stepped in first to check on her, the young girl immediately shrank back, shaking her head, her thin shoulders trembling with fear and confusion. She didn't scream, didn't cry out loud, only folded herself inward like a small wounded animal that had learned the world wasn't safe, that it was better not to let anyone come too close. But then her gaze slipped past the nurse's shoulder and stopped on Ray standing in the doorway, and something changed in that small face, a faint recognition, as if from within the fevered blur and pain of that rainy night. She had remembered the voice counting beside her ear, the hands that had held her to life. She whispered, her voice hoarse and weak, asking if Ray was the one who had been there, the one who hadn't let her sink away. Ray stepped forward slowly, letting the nurse move aside, and sat down on the edge of the bed, close enough for the young girl to see her, but not so close that she would frighten her. She said yes, she had been there, and now she was here too. Nora looked at her for a long while, her eyes still filled with suspicion. Then those thin shoulders slowly loosened, the tension in her body easing little by little, as if after so many hours alone inside her fear, she had finally found something to hold on to. An older nurse standing just outside softly explained to Ray that the young girl hadn't only been injured in the accident, that her heart had been weak since birth, that she was on the waiting list for a new heart, and that the shock of that night had made her condition more fragile than ever. Ray listened, feeling a strange weight press down on her chest, the weight of understanding that the child she had just pulled back from death was still living beneath the shadow of another kind of death, one more patient and impossible to drive away with her hands. Nora clutched Ray's sleeve, her thin fingers gripping the worn fabric, and she looked up at her with the eyes every abandoned child has, eyes used to waiting for people who never come back. She asked, her voice breaking in her throat, where her brother was, whether he was here, whether he had left her, because in the end everyone left her anyway. That question hung in the small room, bare and painful enough that Ray felt as if someone had tightened a fist around her heart. Because she knew too well what it felt like to wait for someone who didn't come, what it felt like to believe she wasn't worth having anyone stay. She didn't tell the young girl the truth, that her brother was lying motionless in another room between life and death, because that wasn't the truth a trembling child needed to hear right then. Instead, she placed her hand over the small one, clinging to her sleeve, warm and steady, and said in the gentlest voice she had that her brother hadn't left her. He was only resting so he could get better. "I'm here," she added, "and I'm not going anywhere." Nora looked at her, searching her face for some sign of the lie she had become far too used to recognizing. But she didn't find one, and so her eyes filled with tears, not from fear anymore, but from something more fragile, something like trust, and she nodded, holding tightly to Ray's hand as if it were the only real thing in the whole world. The young girl refused to let go of Ray's hand, and when a hospital social worker was called in, a middle-aged woman wearing glasses with a folder tucked beneath her arm, she quickly understood what everyone could already see, that this child, a minor with no conscious guardian beside her, because her only brother was lying in a coma, wouldn't allow anyone else near her except the thin woman who had just walked in. The social worker spoke quietly with the attending doctor in the hallway, then came back and told Ray that if she agreed to stay beside the child for a while, the hospital would allow it, but staff would have to supervise during every shift. Everything had to follow the rules, because this was a situation unlike any procedure they had ever had. Ray nodded almost before she had time to think, because the small hand gripping hers had already answered for her. But the very moment she agreed, another weight pressed down at once, the weight of another name, another child waiting for her somewhere else. When Nora finally fell asleep from exhaustion, her fingers slowly loosening from Ray's sleeve, Ray slipped quietly into the hallway, pulled the cracked screen phone from her pocket, and called home with trembling hands because she knew she had broken her promise. The babysitter answered in a tired voice edged with reproach, saying it was far too late, that she had things of her own to do, and Ray hurried to apologize, to promise, to beg for just a little more time, until the woman finally handed the phone to the boy. Sammy's breathing came through the receiver before his voice did, that familiar wheezing sound that made her heart tighten every time she heard it, the sound of his small lungs struggling for each breath on this damp night. He asked where she was, his voice sleepy and hurt, then asked when she was coming home, because she had promised to read him a story tonight. Ray leaned back against the cold wall of the hospital hallway, closed her eyes, and felt her heart being torn in two in the truest sense, one half here with the unfamiliar child sleeping behind that door, the other half at home with her own flesh and blood, breathing with difficulty and waiting for her to come back. She spoke to him in the gentlest voice she had, telling him she was sorry, that tonight there was a very sick young girl who needed her to stay, that did he remember how she had taught him that when someone needed them, they shouldn't abandon that person. Sammy was silent for a moment, then asked with the blunt logic of a child, "Then what about me when I need you too?" And that question almost made her collapse right there. She drew in a deep breath, holding back the tears that were rising hard, and told him that he was the most precious thing in her life, that she would come home as soon as she could, that he should close his eyes and imagine her sitting beside his bed reading him a story, and she would truly do it the moment she got home. He told her to remember to give medicine to that young girl, his voice already sinking with sleep, and Ray let out a soft laugh through her tears, promising that she would remember. When the call ended, she stood there in the empty hallway for a long while, exhausted down to the marrow of her bones. Over the past 2 days she had barely slept, hadn't worked a single shift, hadn't added $1 to the empty wallet in her pocket, and now she was carrying on her shoulders not one child but two. One child who needed a new heart, and one child who needed stronger lungs, both of them needing her in ways she wasn't sure she had the strength to answer. She thought of the bills on the kitchen table, of the empty refrigerator, of the cruel truth that kindness couldn't pay the electric bill, that every hour she stayed here was an hour she wasn't earning food for her own son. And yet when she turned back and looked through the glass panel in the hospital room door, when she saw Nora's small pale face sleeping peacefully, no longer curled tight in fear for the first time, Ray knew that no matter how drained she was, she couldn't walk away, because inside her there was still a kind of light that poverty and exhaustion, after all these years, still hadn't managed to put out. The next morning, when Ray returned to the hospital after a few brief hours of sleep at home beside Sammy, she found Wendell waiting at the corner of the quiet hallway, still in that neatly pressed dark suit, still carrying the calm posture of a man used to controlling every situation. He nodded in greeting, then glanced toward a small room at the end of the corridor, an empty waiting room he had clearly chosen in advance for its privacy. Ray followed him, a vague sense of foreboding rising inside her, and when the door closed behind them, Wendell placed a thick envelope on the low table in the middle of the room, the kind of envelope whose swollen weight alone was enough to tell her it held more money than Ray earned in an entire year. He pushed it toward her with 2 fingers, slowly and decisively, like a man completing a transaction he had carried out 1,000 times before. "You did what you had to do," he said, his voice still polite, but now edged with a colder practicality. "Now take this and go. Leave the city if you want. Start over somewhere else. The man I serve doesn't like owing anyone anything, and this is how things are settled." He said it as though he were granting her a kindness, as though he were opening a door out of her hard, cramped life, and by the logic of his world, it truly was a kindness, an escape that hundreds of other people would have seized without the slightest hesitation. Ray looked at the envelope lying there on the table, and for one moment she couldn't deny that something inside her trembled, because she was exhausted, she was drowning in debt, her son was sick, and the money in that envelope could wipe away all those sleepless nights of worry, could pay off the hospital bills, could buy enough medicine for Sammy to last the whole year. She thought of all those things in a silence so long that Wendell must have believed she was about to take it. But then she looked up, and she shook her head. She said she couldn't accept it. Wendell frowned, thinking she believed it wasn't enough, and he said if she felt it was too little, they could negotiate. The number wasn't the problem. But Ray shook her head again, and this time she spoke more clearly, saying the problem wasn't whether it was a lot or a little. It was that she hadn't saved the young girl to be paid, and if she accepted this money, then what she had done that night would become something else, something that could be bought and sold. And she didn't want the one beautiful thing she had done in a very long time to be turned into merchandise. She added, her voice softening, that if they truly wanted to thank her, then what she hoped for was that the young girl would get well, that was all. Wendell stood there, and for the first time in a very long life, his weathered face couldn't hide its astonishment. He had sat across from powerful men and desperate ones, had watched people betray one another for sums far smaller than this, had seen greed twist human beings into every possible shape, and through all those years he had come to one firm belief, that everyone had a price, that if the number was large enough, no principle could remain standing. And yet here, this thin woman with worn-down shoes and a phone with a cracked screen was gently pushing the envelope back toward him, not with false pride, not with calculation meant to make him offer more, but with a true quietness that left him with no words to answer her. He looked at her for a long time, trying to read the hidden trick that a lifetime of experience told him had to be there somewhere. But he found nothing at all, and it was that emptiness, that bare truth that this woman simply wanted nothing, that shook something inside the cold old man in a way he wasn't ready to admit. He picked up the envelope, slipped it back inside his coat, and before he left, he stopped at the doorway, turned his head, and looked at her one last time, as if he were looking at something he had believed no longer existed in this world. In small towns and cramped harbor neighborhoods, news traveled faster than the sea wind, and by the time Ray returned to the diner where she had washed dishes for 3 years, she understood at once that the story of that rainy night had arrived long before she did. She felt it before anyone said a single word, in the way her former coworker stopped talking when she walked in the stolen glances that flicked toward her, and then quickly turned away, in the thick silence settling over the kitchen that was usually filled with the clatter of dishes and laughter. Some looked at her with clear fear, as if simply standing near her was enough to let the dark shadow of the veil world fall over them, as if she had brought back from that bridge some kind of curse that could spread. An older cook who used to share the leftover bread with her at the end of a shift now avoided her eyes, whispering to the person beside her that getting mixed up with people like that never led to anything good. But more painful than the fear was the contempt, the way a few people dropped pointed remarks about what she must have received, about what reason a woman who washed dishes could possibly have for lingering around the family of an underworld boss, if it wasn't money. Words that didn't need to be direct to cut into her heart. They had decided who she was before she had the chance to open her mouth, just as Detective Pryor had done, just as this whole world always did with people like her, poor people who weren't allowed the benefit of the doubt. When the owner called her into the small office in the back, Ray already knew what was coming. He didn't look her in the eye, only nervously turned the pen in his hand and stammered that this wasn't her fault, that he had nothing against her. But customers were talking. A few had said they wouldn't come back if they still saw her here, and a little restaurant like his couldn't survive a scandal, couldn't take a risk for one dishwasher, no matter how hard-working she was. He said she brought trouble, and though he tried to wrap it in gentle words, the meaning of it remained naked and cold. She was no longer welcome there. Ray stood there quietly and accepted the small amount of pay for her final days, without arguing, without begging, because she had grown so used to being pushed to the margins that she no longer had the strength to fight it. She walked out of the diner in the harsh brightness of the noon sun, and this time no shadow from the underworld followed her, only the bare reality that she had just lost one of the 2 meager sources of income she had, and that the decent thing she had done on that bridge was demanding from her a price she had never foreseen. That evening, sitting at the kitchen table in her cramped apartment, while Sammy slept soundly in the bedroom, she spread the envelopes of bills before her, beneath the weak yellow light, and she counted the numbers over and over, numbers that would never be enough no matter how many times she counted them. The hospital debt from Caleb's final days was still there, towering like a wall, And now there was Sammy's medicine on top of it, the rent coming due, the electric bill with the red warning line she had seen so many times that it no longer startled her, only made her more tired. She thought about the thick envelope Wendell had placed in front of her, thought about everything it could have erased in a single moment. And for the first time, a small voice inside her head whispered that maybe she had been too foolish, that what good were principles and self-respect when her son didn't have medicine to help him breathe. She covered her face with both hands and sat for a long time in the stillness of the kitchen. And for just those few brief minutes, she let herself feel the full weight of everything pressing down on her thin shoulders, the weight she had always hidden from her son, from the world, the weight of a woman who had given too much and received too little in return. It was long past midnight when Ray sat in her old sedan parked outside the hospital's dark parking lot, the engine still running, both hands resting on the steering wheel without moving, while the light from a single street lamp spilled through the windshield and cast a pale yellow glow over her exhausted face. She had promised Nora she would come back, and she had driven here like she did every night. But tonight something inside her had reached its final limit, that point where even the strongest people have to break. She hadn't slept one full night in days, had lost her job, had counted and recounted money that would never be enough, had watched her son struggle to breathe, without having enough money to buy better medicine, and now, sitting in this darkness, she felt a temptation she had never allowed herself to feel before, the temptation to let everything go. She thought about it coldly and practically, not as a passing thought, but as a real choice opening before her eyes. She could back out of this parking lot right now, could drive away and never come back, could take Sammy out of this city that had cast her aside, to somewhere no one knew her name, no one connected her to the Vale name, no one forced her to pay a price for her kindness. The child lying inside wasn't her child, she told herself. That family wasn't her family. And she had already done more than anyone had the right to ask of a woman who owed them nothing. She had saved the young girl's life already. She had paid the debt of her conscience. And no law, no promise, could force her to keep pouring the last drops of her strength into a story that would only break her further. She placed her hand on the gear shift, and for one long, breathless moment, she truly meant to do it, truly meant to drive away forever. But her hand didn't move. She sat there, looking up at the lit windows of the hospital above, and though she tried to stop herself, her mind still found its way to the window of the room where a 16-year-old girl was sleeping, a girl who had asked her, with the eyes of every child ever abandoned, whether Ray would leave her too. She remembered the way those thin shoulders had loosened when Nora recognized her, the way those small fingers had clung to her sleeve as if Ray were the only real thing in the world, the way she had trusted her, truly trusted her, after the world had taught her not to trust anyone. And then Ray thought of the words she had spoken, that her brother hadn't left her, that Ray was here, that she wasn't going anywhere. Words she had said with her whole heart in that moment. If she drove away tonight, she would become the very thing Nora feared most. She would become one more adult disappearing from her life, one more broken promise, one more piece of proof for that bitter belief that everyone left in the end. And Ray couldn't do that, not because of the law, not because of what people would think, but because she knew too well what it felt like to be left behind, knew too well the hollow space someone's leaving carved into a child's heart. She remembered Caleb, remembered what he had once believed, that people didn't get to choose who deserved saving. They simply saved, and she realized that leaving would not only betray that young girl, but also betray the person Ray had always tried to become, the person Caleb had loved, the person she wanted Sammy to grow up seeing and feel proud of. Ray closed her eyes, let a tear roll down her cheek, then turned off the engine. The temptation was still there. It hadn't disappeared, but it had been pressed down by something stronger, something she couldn't name, but that had always guided her through the darkest nights of her life. She stepped out of the car, pulled her thin coat around herself against the cold, and walked toward the hospital lights, every step heavy but steady, returning to her promise, returning to the child waiting for her, because in the end, that was who she was, the one who stayed, even when staying was the hardest thing of all. Pryor was waiting for her in the hospital hallway when she stepped out of Nora's room the next morning. Leaning against the wall near the vending machine, both hands in his pockets, with the look of a man who had been standing there for a while and had meant for her to find him. This time he hadn't come as part of an interrogation. There was no closed room, no file, only two people standing in the middle of a brightly lit hallway, and Ray immediately sensed that what he was about to say wouldn't be written down in any report. He asked whether she knew what she was getting herself pulled into, and before she could answer, he began telling her about the man lying in a coma upstairs, about the name Desmond Vile, a name this whole city spoke only in whispers. He said he had spent many years watching that man, that behind the expensive suit and the calm appearance was a world people like Ray shouldn't set foot in, a world of things he didn't need to describe in detail for her to understand they were dark and dangerous. He said she was standing too close to something that could swallow her whole, that she had a son who needed his mother, that her kindness, however real it might be, was placing her in the sights of people she didn't want to be involved with. "Do you think that man is worth trading all of this for?" he asked, his voice not mocking at all, but strangely serious, almost like a sincere warning. Ray listened to him until the end without interrupting, and when he stopped, she was silent for a moment, then said in a calm but firm voice that she hadn't saved that man's criminal record. She hadn't saved the Vale name, hadn't saved the things he had done, hadn't saved the world Mr. Pryor had just spoken of. She said she had saved a 16-year-old child who had stopped breathing beneath her hands in the rain, a young girl who had done nothing wrong, a young girl who had no choice in the family she was born into. As for who that man was and what he had done, that was between him and the law, between him and his own conscience, not something she had the right to judge when deciding whether a life should be allowed to go out. She said that if she began weighing who deserved to be saved and who didn't, based on what she had heard or the names people placed on them, then she was no longer someone who saved people. She became something else, and that wasn't the person she wanted to become. Pryor looked at her, and this time something in his seasoned, skeptical eyes seemed to waver, a flash of hesitation he himself hadn't expected. He had spent his entire career dividing the world into two clean halves, the guilty and the innocent, criminals and victims, and he had been so certain of that line that it had become the foundation of everything he did. And yet the thin woman standing before him now, with dark circles beneath her eyes from lack of sleep and shoes worn down at the soles, had just placed before him a question he had forgotten existed for many years. The question of whether a human being could be reduced entirely to the worst thing they had ever done, and whether kindness had to examine whether its recipient was worthy before it could truly be called kindness. He opened his mouth as if to say something more, perhaps another warning, perhaps a question, but at that very moment, a sound spread down the hallway, hurried footsteps from nurses, the alarm of some device coming from the far end of the floor, and a young nurse rushed past them, stopping just long enough to let out the news neither of them had expected to hear at that moment. "The man in intensive care," the nurse said, her breathing quick. "He's just woken up." And in that instant, Ray felt as if the whole hallway tilted beneath her feet, because she knew that the only person in the world who could speak the truth about that rainy night, the only person who knew exactly what she had done, had just opened his eyes and returned to the world. Desmond Vile opening his eyes didn't mean he immediately returned, and it took several more days before the man was truly awake enough to understand where he was and what had happened. In those first days, he drifted between fevered darkness and consciousness, sensing everything through a fog of pain medication and the ache of wounds healing slowly, dimly hearing the sound of machines, footsteps, and voices whispering around his bed. But little by little, his memory came back to him, not as scattered fragments, but with a wholeness so cruel it was almost merciless, and that rainy night rose clearly in his mind every time he closed his eyes. He remembered the sound of metal grinding against metal, remembered the moment the car rolled onto its side, and the world turned upside down, remembered the taste of blood in his mouth and the crushing weight on his chest that wouldn't let him breathe. But more than anything, he remembered a face, the face of a woman bending down by the car door in the rain, drenched and trembling, a woman he had never met before, the woman who hadn't run away. He remembered what he had whispered, remembered begging her to save Nora first, and he remembered that the woman hadn't asked who he was, hadn't hesitated, had only dropped to her knees beside his sister and started fighting death itself to bring the child back to life. When at last he was clear-headed enough to speak, Wendell was the first person he called for, and the loyal old man sat beside his bed and told him everything that had happened while he had lain motionless. Wendell told him that Nora had awakened, that the child would only allow one person near her, and about that woman, the one who had stayed at the hospital day after day, though no one paid her a single dollar. Then, with a rare hesitation, Wendell told him about the envelope he had placed in front of her, about the amount of money large enough to change an entire life, and about how she had pushed it back without taking a single dollar. He repeated what she had said, that she hadn't saved the young girl to be paid, that if she accepted the money, what she had done would become something that could be bought and sold, and Wendell admitted, in the voice of a man still trying to understand, that in all his years serving the Vile family, he had never met anyone who refused money that way. Wendell told him the rest as well, that the woman had lost her job because of the rumors tied to the Vale name, that she was raising a small sickly son, that she carried debts on her shoulders that the money in that envelope could have erased in a single moment, and still she had refused. Desmond lay still and listened, his gray eyes fixed on the stark white ceiling, and something inside him shifted, something he hadn't felt in a very long time. His whole life had been built on one cold and simple belief, that every person could be bought, that loyalty was something paid for with money, that behind every act of kindness there was always a hidden price, a calculation, something someone wanted to take. He had survived and risen in a world that operated exactly by that rule, and he had never had a reason to question it. And yet now there was a woman with nothing in her hands who had saved his sister's life, refused his reward, paid with her own fragile livelihood, and still stayed, not for him, but for a child she hadn't even known. It didn't fit any formula he had ever known, didn't belong in any calculation he had ever made, and it was precisely that lack of fit that made him unable to stop thinking about her. He turned to Wendell, his voice still hoarse and weak after those long days of silence, and said he wanted to meet that woman, wanted to see with his own eyes the person who had done all those things without asking for anything. Because for the first time in a very long life, Desmond Vile had come across something he couldn't understand, and he needed to understand it. They met for the first time in a private hospital room on the highest floor, where Desmond had been moved as soon as his condition allowed. A quiet room with large windows looking out over the gray harbor, completely different from the cramped, noisy corridors where Ray had grown used to coming and going. When she stepped inside, the man who had once lain motionless behind the steering wheel was now sitting propped against white pillows, his face still pale and hollow, but those gray eyes had regained their sharpness, and they followed her from the moment she appeared at the doorway, assessing, measuring, trying to read who she was in the same way he read everyone. For a moment, two people stood facing each other across the distance of an entire world, a man who ruled through fear and wealth, and a woman who washed dishes and had nothing but her calloused hands, and that distance seemed to thicken in the air between them. He thanked her, in a hoarse but clear voice, thanked her for saving Nora, and Ray only nodded faintly, answering that she was glad the young girl was getting better. Then Desmond went straight to the matter he had been thinking about for the past several days. He said Wendell had told him about the envelope, about how she had refused it, and he understood. Perhaps cash had been an insult, too crude a way to repay her, so he offered something else. He said he knew about her hospital debt, knew about her sickly son, knew about the apartment she was struggling to hold on to, and he said all of those things could disappear. The debt would be cleared, he said, as though it were the simplest thing in the world. Her son would have the best doctors. She would have a decent job, a decent home, safety for both herself and her child. He said those things not like a gift but like an arrangement already made, like a man used to giving an order and having the world move according to his will. And Ray understood, immediately, that this wasn't like Wendell's envelope. This was something far larger, a complete shelter that could lift her and Sammy out of the mire of poverty in a single night. But she understood something else too, something she felt down in the marrow of her bones, that accepting all of those things would mean she belonged to him, that she would become a thing inside his arranged world, a person indebted and therefore possessed, and that the kindness she had freely given in the rain would be tied forever to an invisible string. She shook her head, slowly but firmly. She said she thanked him, but she couldn't accept. She said that if she let him pay for everything, then that night would no longer be something she had chosen to do. It would become a bargain, and she hadn't saved Nora in exchange for a new life. She had saved the young girl because it was the right thing to do. She didn't want to be owned, she said softly, even if that ownership came wrapped in velvet and called itself gratitude. Desmond looked at her, and this time something changed in his face, confusion turning into something almost like anger, not because she had refused, but because he couldn't grasp her, couldn't place her into any compartment in the coldly ordered world he knew. At last he asked her the question that had tormented him since he woke, asking it directly in a low, sharp voice. Whether she knew who he was, whether she knew how many people in this city had hoped he would die that night, whether she knew how much safer it would have been for her to drive away. Then why, he asked, his gray eyes locked on hers. Why did she stop? Why did she save someone like me? And Ray stood there in the quiet room, daylight from the large window falling across her tired face, knowing that the answer to that question lay somewhere very deep inside her, in a wound she had never told anyone about. Ray was silent for a long time, and when she finally spoke, her voice was so soft that Desmond had to lean forward to hear her. She said her husband had once been a firefighter, a man named Caleb, someone who had spent his entire life rushing into places other people ran from. She told him that Caleb never asked who the person trapped inside a fire was, never weighed whether they deserved to be saved or not. He simply went in and brought them out, because to him, a life was a life, with no exceptions and no conditions. She said he had died 2 years ago in a warehouse fire, when he went back one last time to search for someone who later turned out to have already escaped. That he had died because of the very part of him that never abandoned anyone, and that he had left her with a little boy, a stack of bills, and an emptiness nothing could ever fill. Desmond listened without interrupting, his gray eyes following every expression on her face. But then Ray went on, and her voice lowered, entering a dark place she had never allowed anyone to step into. She said there was one thing she had never told anyone, not even herself on the nights when she tried to forget it. Many years ago, before she had ever met Caleb, late one night when she was still very young and very afraid of the world, she had walked past someone collapsed by the side of the road in an empty neighborhood. She had seen that person needed help, had clearly seen it, but she had been afraid of getting involved, afraid that stopping would pull her into trouble she couldn't carry. And so she had done the thing the whole world kept teaching people to do. She had turned away. She had kept walking. She had told herself someone else would take care of it, that it wasn't her business. She said she never knew what happened to that person, and it was that not knowing that had followed her for years, the thought that maybe one small act from her could be changed everything, that she had been given the chance to be a good person, and had chosen fear instead of compassion. She said that night had become a quiet wound inside her, something she carried like a stone in her chest, and that when she met Caleb, when she saw the way he lived, she silently swore to herself that she would never turn away again, that no matter how afraid she was, no matter what the cost might be, she would stop, she would stay. She lifted her eyes to Desmond, and they were bright with tears, but her voice was steady. So when she saw his car overturned on the bridge that night, she said, and when she had almost driven away, as her fears urged her to do, she heard the young girl, and she knew that if she left again this time, she would never be able to forgive herself. She didn't stop because of who he was, she said. She stopped because she couldn't bear one more moment of turning away in her life. She stopped because of the person she wanted to become, because of the husband who had taught her that kindness wasn't something people handed out only to those who deserved it, but something they gave simply because they were human. The room sank into a deep silence when she finished, and Desmond Vale, a man who had heard countless lies, countless flatteries, countless pleas and threats throughout his life, sat there stunned and still, because he realized that what she had just said was the most bare and honest truth he had ever heard. This woman hadn't saved him because she feared him, hadn't saved him because she wanted to use him, hadn't saved him because of any calculation at all. She had saved him because of a vow she had made to herself, because of a wound she was trying to heal, because she was fighting the worst part of herself and she had won. And in that moment, something inside that powerful man cracked open, something he had sealed away long ago, because he realized that he and this woman weren't so different after all. They both carried an old wound inside them. Both were trying to atone for something, only they had chosen different roads all the way to the end. For a long while, Desmond said nothing, his gaze shifting toward the large window, where the gray harbor stretched beneath a sky heavy with clouds. And when he finally spoke, his voice was different, deeper, stripped of some of its familiar steel, as if Ray's confession had opened a door inside him that he too wanted to step through. He said she had told him about her wound, so he thought she deserved to hear the truth about him. Not the truth the whole city whispered, but the truth buried beneath it all. He told her that he and Nora hadn't always lived in rooms like this, that there had been a time when they were only two children in a small house, with an ordinary father, an ordinary mother, and an ordinary life. Then their parents were gone, both of them, so close together that he barely had time to breathe between the two losses. And suddenly he, still very young then, became all that was left for a tiny little sister with a heart that had been sick from the moment she was born. He said the first doctors had spoken plainly to him about the cost of keeping Nora alive, numbers so enormous that to a young man with no job, no education, and no one standing behind him, they sounded like a death sentence pronounced over the sister he loved more than his own life. He said he had tried to do every honest thing a man like him could do, and every one of those doors had slammed shut, that this world had no room for kindness when you were poor and desperate, and holding a dying little sister in your arms. And so he had chosen another path, a path he had known was dark from the very first step. But it was the only path he could see that might lead to the money that would keep Nora's heart beating. He didn't describe in detail the things he had done, and Ray didn't ask, but there was a heaviness in his voice that told her they were things he could never wash away. He said every brick in the empire people feared had been laid down for one reason only, so Nora could have the best doctors, the best medicines, a place on the waiting list, a chance to live. Everything he had built, every name people had given him, every fear he had spread, all of it was only the shell around a truth so simple it was heartbreaking, that a brother had been trying to save his only sister, and had lost himself in the process. He said there were nights when he asked himself whether Nora would still love him if she knew the truth, whether the life he had preserved through those dark means had been worth trading away his own soul, and that he had never dared answer that question until he was lying on that bridge, believing he was about to die, and the only thing he still cared about was her. Desmond turned back to Ray, and for the first time, those cold gray eyes revealed something that wasn't power or calculation, but a deep exhaustion, the exhaustion of a man who had carried a burden for too long without anyone knowing it was there. He said he had told himself for years that he had no other choice, that circumstance had forced him to become this man, and he had believed it because it helped him sleep at night. But while lying motionless in the hospital bed over the past few days, listening to Wendell tell him about a woman with nothing in her hands, who still chose kindness, even when it cost her everything, he had been forced to face a thought he had spent his whole life running from, that perhaps people always have a choice, that circumstance can explain what we do, but it can never erase our responsibility for the choices we make. And for the first time, the man who had once ruled an entire region through fear sat there, bare and fragile, facing the true cost of everything he had traded away, while Desmond was gradually recovering, and something lighter began to seep into the cold walls of the hospital room. Out there in the world he had been absent from for so many days, things weren't nearly as calm as they seemed on the surface. Wendell was the first to sense it, with the instinct sharpened over several decades of living in a world where survival depended on being able to read the smallest signs. He noticed calls that weren't answered at the right time, orders carried out one beat slower than usual, eyes that avoided his when he entered a room, and above all, he realized that the truth about Desmond's condition, about just how weak he had been in those first days, had leaked outside in a way that shouldn't have been possible, unless someone on the inside had deliberately let it slip. In the sealed structure Desmond had built with such care, only a very small number of people were allowed to know where he was and what condition he was in, and that very fact narrowed the list of suspects, down to only a few names, all of them trusted people, people with access to secret information, people standing close enough to know when the lion was wounded. Wendell began quietly following the threads, and what he found made his heart go cold. There was one man among them, Someone who had climbed for years through cunning and ambition. Someone who always smiled at the right time and said exactly what needed to be said, who had been quietly meeting people he shouldn't have met, quietly moving pieces he had no right to touch. Wendell understood at once the nature of what was happening, because he had witnessed it many times in his life, the ruthless law of this world, that when the man at the top falls, even temporarily, there is always someone waiting to seize the empty place, and that a wounded man lying in a hospital is vulnerable in ways he never has to fear when he is strong. The traitor knew Desmond was weak, knew exactly where he was, and knew this chance wouldn't come a second time. Wendell came to Desmond's bedside and told him everything he had discovered, his voice low and urgent, and he saw Desmond's recovering face harden, his gray eyes returning to their familiar cold sharpness. But this time there was something else there too, a fear not for himself, but for the person in the room at the end of the hallway. Because both men understood that in their world, whoever wanted to take Desmond's power wouldn't aim only at him, but at everything that made him vulnerable, and nothing on this earth made Desmond Vale more vulnerable than his little sister. Desmond immediately ordered more guards around Nora's area, ordered that no one be allowed near the girl, except those he personally trusted, and for the first time since waking, he forced himself to sit upright in bed despite the pain, as if the very thought of danger closing in was enough to pull him to his feet. But neither he nor Wendell knew exactly when the traitor would strike, and that was the most frightening thing of all. The feeling of knowing a storm was coming, without knowing what hour or moment it would fall. In the room at the end of the hallway, Ray was sitting beside Nora and reading her a story, completely unaware of the dark threads tightening around this place, unaware that the world she had accidentally stepped into was about to show her its darkest face, and that within only a few hours, she would have to face a choice even harder than the rainy night on the bridge, a choice from which there would be no way back. That night, when the hospital hallway had sunk into the dim stillness of the late hours, Ray was still sitting beside Nora's bed, closing the book after the young girl had drifted towards sleep, when she began to feel that something was wrong. At first it was only a vague feeling, the kind of instinct people who have lived through too much hardship learn to trust, but then it became clearer. She realized that the guard who usually stood at the head of the hallway was no longer there, that the row of lights in that area had suddenly grown darker than usual, that strange footsteps were echoing somewhere in the distance, slow and deliberate, not the hurried pace of nurses or the weary walk of patients' families. Ray's heart began to beat faster, and though she didn't fully understand everything happening in the world she had accidentally stepped into, she understood enough to know that the fragile peace of this room was about to be broken. She didn't waste time wondering why or how, because the mother's instinct inside her, the instinct hardened through sleepless nights beside Sammy's bed, rose at once and swept every fear aside. She gently shook Nora awake, placed one finger against her lips to signal silence, and told the young girl in a voice that was calm and tender that they were going to play a game, that the two of them were going to a quieter place to rest, that everything was all right. She didn't allow even the smallest trace of panic to enter her voice, because she knew the last thing she wanted was to frighten this child who was already so fragile, and she was shielding her not only from the danger coming closer, but also from the fear of it. Nora, still drowsy and completely trusting the woman who hadn't left her, obediently let Ray help her sit up and wrap a coat around her thin shoulders. Ray supported her, careful with the wires and medical equipment, moving slowly but firmly, and she led the young girl out of the room through the side door. She had come to know well after so many days of coming and going there. On the way, she ran into one of the men Wendell trusted, a guard who was searching urgently, and from his eyes alone she confirmed what she had feared, that the danger was real and it was very close. She quickly told him where she was going, and the man immediately led the two of them through empty corridors to a secure area of the hospital, a fortified room where more guards personally trusted by Desmond were already standing watch, a place where no stranger could slip inside. Ray brought Nora in, settled her into a soft chair, knelt down at eye level with her, and took her small hands. She told her that she was in a very safe place, that good people were standing guard outside, that all she needed to do was stay here and rest, and that no matter what happened, nothing would be able to touch her. Nora looked at her, and though a trace of confusion passed through those young eyes, she still nodded, because she had learned to believe that when this woman said, "Everything would be all right," everything truly would be all right. Ray stayed with her for a while longer, stroking her hair, telling her a small story in a whisper until her shoulders relaxed again, and the wariness inside her dissolved, leaving her in the safe arms of the guards, completely separated from whatever was about to unfold outside. Only when she was certain the young girl was fully protected, that no sound or image of the danger could reach her in that quiet room, did Ray stand, and something inside her tightened, because she knew that by bringing Nora to safety, she had placed herself on the road back toward danger, and that tonight's story wasn't over yet. On the other side of the hospital, in the room where Desmond lay recovering, the air had thickened into something sharp as a knife. Wendell stood near the door, alert to every sound in the hallway, while Desmond, though still weak, had forced himself upright in bed, his gray eyes returning to the cold sharpness of the man who had once ruled an entire region. When the door opened, the person who stepped inside wasn't a stranger, but one of the most trusted names, a man who had stood beside Desmond for many years, a man Desmond had once trusted enough to hand important matters over to him. He entered with a faint smile, the kind of smile Wendell had learned not to trust, and he closed the door behind him with a slow, calculating movement. He said he had been waiting for this moment for a long time, that he was tired of standing beneath the shadow of a man who now couldn't even get out of a hospital bed on his own. He spoke of power, of opportunity, of the ruthless law of their world, that the weak had to make room for the strong, and that tonight was the night the order of things would change. Desmond didn't show fear, though his body betrayed him with a weakness he couldn't hide, and he told the traitor in a voice so calm it was chilling, that if he thought things were that simple, then he had misjudged everything. A struggle began, tension rising with every second. Wendell immediately lunged forward to stand between the traitor and the bed, and the two men grappled in the cramped space, furniture crashing over, their ragged breathing filling the room. Desmond tried to force himself up to help his loyal companion, but his still wounded body made him stagger, and in a moment when it seemed as though the balance was about to tip toward the wicked man, the door burst open again. Pryor stormed in, followed by several of his people, their guns already drawn, his voice ringing out with a firm order for everyone to stay still. The detective had been watching this place for days, had sensed that something was moving in the shadows, and tonight that instinct had brought him here at exactly the right moment. In that brief instant, Pryor stood in the middle of the room and faced a choice his entire career hadn't prepared him for. Before him was Desmond Vale, the name he had hunted for many years, the man every professional instinct told him was a monster who needed to be brought down. But before him as well was another man attacking someone who was wounded, a man whose cruelty showed clearly in every movement. And in that split second, Pryor realized that the line between good and evil he had trusted all his life, the line drawn by names and case files, wasn't as simple as he had once believed. The thin woman had once stood before him and said that she hadn't saved a criminal record, she had saved a human being, and now, standing in this room, he understood what she had meant. He didn't hesitate for long. He ordered his men to restrain the traitor, and within moments the man who had caused all of this was forced down, handcuffed, his resistance dissolving into helpless curses. The room slowly settled, heavy breathing replacing the sounds of struggle, and Pryor stood there looking at Desmond, two men from opposite sides of a long war, seeing each other for the first time not as hunter and prey, but as two human beings. Desmond, still breathless from the effort, lifted his eyes to the detective and said quietly that he knew Pryor could have chosen another way, could have stood still and let everything unfold in a manner that would have solved his own problem. Pryor didn't answer at once. He only looked at Desmond for a long time, then said that his job was to protect lives, all lives, even the lives he didn't like, and that tonight he had only done his job. But both men knew that something had changed in that room, something larger than the capture of a traitor, a quiet acknowledgement that people were more complicated than the labels the world placed on them, and that sometimes the boundary between the hunter and the hunted was far thinner than anyone imagined. The betrayal that night didn't end with only one man in handcuffs. It also brought down the fragile structure Desmond had spent so many years carefully maintaining, because once the most trusted man had turned against him, The remaining ties snapped apart with him, loyalty dissolved, and the empire that had once made the whole city tremble began breaking open from within, like something that had been hollow for a long time. Lying in his hospital bed in the days that followed, Desmond understood that he was standing at a crossroads he had never dared to imagine in all his life. He could try to patch the broken pieces back together, could step once more into the fight to reclaim what had been lost, could prolong the dark spiral he had lived inside for far too long. Or he could do something else, something that only a few weeks earlier he would have considered unthinkable. And he chose something else. When Pryor returned to the hospital, not as a hunter but as a man waiting for a decision, Desmond told him he was ready to cooperate, ready to say what he knew, ready to help close not only his own chapter, but also the dark networks he had once been part of. It wasn't an easy decision, and it didn't come without a price. Desmond understood very clearly that cooperating meant he would have to face the legal consequences of what he had done, that there would be years he would have to pay for the path he had chosen. And he accepted that with a calmness that surprised even Pryor. Because with the empire shattered and with the protection of the authorities for a valuable witness like him, the danger from those who remained no longer had enough strength to threaten him or Nora, and for the first time in his life, Desmond could think about the future without looking over his shoulder. When Pryor asked why he had chosen this road, after so many years of standing against everything the detective represented, Desmond was silent for a moment, then said that he had spent his whole life telling himself he had done everything for Nora, that every dark thing could be justified if it kept her alive. But a woman with nothing in her hands had shown him that people always had another choice, that they could hold on to the people they loved without losing their souls, and he said he didn't want Nora to grow up and look at her brother as something the whole city feared. He wanted her to look at him as the person she had always believed him to be. And then, amid all that breaking and all those heavy choices, news arrived that lit up the long stretch of darkness. After all those months waiting on a list that had seemed endless, a matching heart had finally been found for Nora. The surgery lasted for many hours, and Ray stayed through all of it, sitting beside Desmond in the waiting room, two people from two different worlds now sharing the same fear, looking toward the same door, praying in their own ways for a young girl they both loved in different forms. And when the doctor finally stepped out with a tired but radiant smile, telling them the operation had succeeded, that the new heart was beating with strong, healthy rhythms in the young girl's chest, Ray saw the man who had once ruled an entire region through fear lower his head and break down crying like a child, his broad shoulders shaking with an emotion he had held back his whole life. In the days that followed, as Nora slowly recovered, as her pale cheeks began to bloom with a shade of pink no one had ever seen there before, as she laughed, a full laugh no longer shadowed by sickness, Ray stood in the doorway, watching the brother and sister together, and felt a warmth spread through her chest, the rare feeling of someone who had witnessed something truly good take root from the darkest rainy night. About 3 months after the rainy night on the bridge, in a stifling courtroom with white light pouring down from the high ceiling, Raylan Hollister sat in the witness chair, her two hands clenched together in her lap, telling the entire room what she had seen and what she had done on that fateful night. Her testimony, simple and honest, without embellishment, became an important piece in the larger picture that justice was slowly putting together, and alongside it, everything Desmond had willingly handed over, everything he knew, and everything he had chosen to speak aloud, helped bring closure not only to his own case, but also to the dark networks that had once made so many people live in fear. When the judge asked her why she had stopped the car that night, Ray looked straight ahead and answered with a simple sentence, that she had stopped because someone needed to be saved, and she didn't believe people were allowed to choose who deserved to live. The whole courtroom fell silent, and in the back row, Pryor sat listening. The detective who had spent his entire career hunting one name, now looking at that woman with a respect he no longer tried to hide. 6 months after that rainy night, on an autumn afternoon when sunlight poured gold through the small window, the cramped kitchen in Ray's apartment was filled with a sound it had been missing for a very long time, the laughter of children. Sammy, his cheeks healthier and rosier now, thanks to the good medicine she had never been able to afford before, was sitting at the table, scribbling a drawing, while Nora, healthy and radiant, with a new heart beating steadily inside her chest, leaned down to show the little boy how to color the sky. Ray stood by the stove stirring a pot of soup, looked back at the two children, and smiled, and in that moment she realized that this strange patched-together family, assembled from the most broken pieces of life, was whole in a way she had never dared to dream of. She never accepted a single dollar from Desmond, but later she learned that the enormous hospital debt from Caleb's final days, the debt that had weighed on her shoulders for 2 years, had been quietly erased, and that a healthcare fund had been quietly established in Sammy's name, enough to make sure her son would never have to go without medicine, never have to struggle for breath on another cold night again. It wasn't a bribe, wasn't a string meant to bind her, but something else, a giving back. Desmond's way of saying that the woman who had given his sister a chance to live deserved to have that same chance given back to her child. And when there was a soft knock at the door, when Desmond stepped inside with a paper bag of still warm bread in his hand, no longer the man the whole city had once feared, but simply a brother, a friend visiting the people he had learned how to love, Ray realized that sometimes the best things in life take root from the darkest nights. That kindness given without condition has the power to heal not only the one who receives it, but also the one who gives it. This story, more than anything, reminds us of a simple truth we often forget, that a person's true worth doesn't lie in the worst thing they have ever done, nor in what they own or where they stand in society, but in what they choose to do when no one is watching, in the compassion they offer to a stranger in the middle of a rainy night, in the courage to stop when the whole world tells them to keep walking. It reminds us that no one is forever defined by their past, that everyone can choose another road, that redemption can still come to those who dare to pay the price for it, and that sometimes just one kind act from an ordinary person is enough to light a flame that changes many lives. If this story has touched your heart in any way, please subscribe to our channel, press like, and share this video so that every day you can join us in listening to more meaningful and deeply moving stories. We would truly love to know how you feel about Ray and Desmond's story. What part of this story made you stop and think? So please leave a comment and share the honest feelings from deep within your heart, because every line you share is a precious source of encouragement for us. Thank you for taking the time to listen all the way to the final moments, and we wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, peace, and love overflowing every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next stories. And before you leave, please ask yourself one question: who is waiting to be helped on your road tonight? And whether you will be the one who stops.